My biblical history students, I wanted to make a quick video, maybe 10 minutes or so, to kind of highlight some of the things from the first 5 chapters as you're finishing up your 5th chapter and getting ready to write your essay to show me that you understand what these first 5 chapters are about. I just wanted to make a short video to kind of highlight some of the things hopefully you were able to grasp, because as you know now, there was a lot of stuff, a lot of reading in those chapters, but hopefully you were able to kind of make your way through it and understand the basic things. But, like I said, I want to make one video just to clarify. What is at the heart of these first 5 chapters isn't even about biblical history yet. There's no specifics about biblical history yet. He'll get into that in the next section. But what issue Provan is dealing with in these first 5 chapters really is the scholarly ways in which scholars have recently gone about assessing biblical history. And he takes it to a more fundamental level, basically about there's a fundamental question on how do you do historical research? How do you know about history? And what he argues is that a lot of times biblical scholars treat the biblical texts, what we call biblical history, as with different standards than they would any other kind of historical research, be it Roman history, Greek history, any kind of history. And Provan is the fundamental point Provan is making is simply the biblical texts have to be treated in the same way, with the same standards and the same viewpoint as you would reading any other kind of historical text to determine what happened in history. You can't take the biblical text and treat them with a whole different set of standards. And so that is what he's really trying to get at in these first 5 chapters. So he highlights, for the sake of argument, in general, again, this is overgeneralized to a certain extent, the one side, which we could call the minimalist side, which is a lot of the modern scholarship that he is taking to task in these chapters. And that minimalist side looks at the biblical text and basically says, this biblical text, this particular text, was artistically shaped and it has a clear bias and agenda to it. Therefore, we can't believe any of it is historical. And Provan's argument is every ancient text comes from a point of view. Every ancient text, in fact, every text, every movie, every book about history you've ever read is shaped and crafted in a way to present that particular author's view of history. That's how we learn history. So therefore, to look at the biblical writers and see that they do similar things that even modern history writers do today and say, oh, but when you do it, therefore, we're going to call everything into question. Provan basically says that doesn't make sense. You have to come to the text, understand the artistic, literary ways they do shape their text, how they went about writing, the historical context, and you have to take all of it into consideration, and you can't just come to the text before you even assess it and go, oh, I know it's not historical. And so he is arguing that you need to assess the biblical text in light of archaeology, in light of the literary way they're written, and you have to use your common sense and put them all together and get the best view you can of history given the text. You can't just throw out the texts. So that is obviously his basic gist that he's getting at in these first 5 chapters. Like I said before, 2 of the things he emphasizes that should be embraced and not as a basis for dismiss the biblical text is the acknowledgement that the biblical texts are artistically shaped. They are literature, and that's okay. And they're also ideological. They have an ideological bent. The writer is writing to try to convince you of something, and that should be expected. But just because it's artistic and it's ideological doesn't mean it's not historical. And we have to realize that when we're reading the text. Basically, when it gets down to it, and I'll give this as an analogy, what he is saying is that the biblical text, when it comes to understanding biblical history, the biblical text really is the only real clear window that we have to the past. We have archaeology and we have some other things we can kind of fit in, and it could help us see it better. But we wouldn't have even known there was a biblical Israel if there was no Old Testament to begin with. Okay? So what he is saying is that the biblical text is the window to that past. Just like any history text is the window to that past. When you read the writings, ancient writings about Julius Caesar, those writings are the window you have to the past. And you have to assess whether or not the writer is what's the word? Not noteworthy. Reliable. Can you trust what he's saying? And you assess that on a case-by-case basis. The same with biblical writers as anything else. But the text is the window to the history. And the problem with the modern minimalist view is it tends to view the text as a curtain that blinds you to the history, and it says, through scientific means we can get behind the curtain to get to the real history. And Provan says, no, the text is the window to that history. It's not the curtain to the history. And so that's what he's really going to be arguing. Now, to take that analogy even further, some texts are more dirty than others. Some windows are a little dirty. It's harder to see in the past, but they're still the windows to that past. So, having said that, that's what he means by, let me see here, we're dependent on the text to understand the history, and our assessment of that witness of the writer is going to be based on whether or not we find that writer reliable. Like he says, our knowledge of the past is our faith in the testimony. Now, when he talks about faith here, he's not talking about, Christian saving faith here. He's just talking about when you read a book, if you find it to be trustworthy, you're going to put your faith, your trust in that book to tell you the truth about the past. And so everything we know about about history in general, from the French Revolution to Genghis Khan to anything, we know about them because we have ancient texts that tell us about them, and we have assessed those texts and think, yes, they are telling the truth about that history. They're telling it from an artistic standpoint, from an ideological standpoint, but it really did happen, and we can know something about the past based on our faith in that testimony of the text. And he's going to say the same thing holds true to the biblical text. That's what we need to do. And so, that being said, obviously the biblical texts are biased in a certain way. They're coming at it from a certain point of view. There's no such thing as objective history whenever you try to tell about history. Yes, you have facts, but any time you talk about history, you're putting it from a point of view. Every time you've watched a documentary, read a history book, the writer, the documentary maker, they're telling you a story. They're doing history, but they're shaping it to tell you a story. And so that's what Provan means when he talked about how does life have a narrative art to it. That's how we learn about history. We storytelling, story comprehending beings, and therefore that is how we convey history. And therefore, as you'll see, when we get to the biblical text, that's the same thing the biblical writers are doing. They're telling of their history, but they're shaping it into a story to tell what they feel is the point of their history, art and ideology. Okay? Now, obviously, along with that, the archaeological world, we've found a lot of things in archaeology that coincide with the biblical story. Some things don't jive perfectly. Some things do verify a lot of the things we find in the Bible, as you'll find out in the next few chapters. But Provan's point with archaeology is that archaeology isn't the gold standard. Archaeology, at best, you find snippets here and there, and they're very good snippets, and they can help us understand the history, but we fit the archaeology in with the text that we have. The more reliable testimony to the past is in written text where people are telling you about the past, not in shards of pottery or whatever else. Those aren't, you don't dismiss them. Obviously, they're very important. But we learn more in the written text. That's what he's saying. And so that's what he's talking about when he's talking about oh my gosh, I know this. And that is what he's talking about when he talks about epistemological openness to the text. You don't just discard the text right away. You don't say everything in the text is 100% true. I just believe it. You know, when you read the Exodus story, you should not think that the Cecil B. DeMille movie Ten Commandments is a documentary, that it would happen exactly that way. You have to be a little bit more critical thinking when you read the text. That they're purporting to be about history, but they are doing a lot of literary shaping as well. And you have to go through it little by little. That's why the analogy he gives of the biblical writers, in fact, every history writer is the equivalent of a portrait painter. Every time you know, the portraits of a certain figure might be different, but you could always tell it's the same figure. And therefore, the biblical writers are doing the same thing. They're painting about their past in a creative way that has different perspectives, but it's still about history. Okay, anyway, I just wanted to run through a number of those things. Those are the things, I think, the more fundamental things that I think are important to get with these first 5 chapters. And so, when you write your essay, I'm not looking for you to rewrite all 5 chapters, but at the same time, I don't want you to be so over general that you say nothing. What I'm looking for in the essays, double space, 1-inch margins, all that stuff, 12-point font, is you show me that you understand the fundamental argument he's making. Okay? Trace the argument he's making. You don't have to go into tons of details. We have the text there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. But you should be able to articulate for me what his basic argument is, how he makes his argument, and some of the main points he makes. That's what I'm going to be reading for. Can you make a clear argument, and can you clearly tell me that you understand some of his major points? That's all I'm going to be looking for. And if you can do that, if you can put in writing an explanation of those 5 chapters, and you can do it in a succinct way, you will have shown me that you understand the more fundamental arguments about how to read the biblical text. And then you'll be in a better position when we get into the biblical text in the next chapter and beyond, how to assess everything. All right, so have fun with that, and I'll be looking at your homework and your essays in the short time in the future. All right, bye.